people trickling in, I'll just go ahead and get going. So my name is Leah Lovelace, and I'm the Director of Folk Art Education at Vesterheim Norwegian American Museum and Folk Art School. We're located in Decorah, Iowa, if you're not familiar. And we are a special place because not only are we a folk art school that have all kinds of classes and disciplines from rose mulling to wood carving to forging to needlework to jewelry and everything in between. We also are a Norwegian American museum that tells the story of Norwegian immigration to America, and we have about 33,000 objects in our collection, which we think is a pretty cool thing. So anyway, we're so pleased that you could be with us tonight. Before we get started, we're going to do a little bit of orientation. So many of you may have already be familiar with a Zoom webinar format. Perhaps you've also been in a situation where you've had a Zoom meeting. So the webinar is a little different from the meeting because in this program, once you're being broadcast to, which you are now, you're invited to actively participate by typing messages to the panelists or other attendees through the chat icon. So if you find your lower bar, your menu bar on your computer screen that has all your Zoom features, you'll see you're automatically going to be muted for the program. Because of the number of participants, it's just easier if you listen to the presentation, and then we can have you interact through the chat and also through the Q&A. So if you want to use the chat and say hello, you can click on the chat icon and type a message. You'll notice you can either type to everyone or you can type to select people. Now, Molly Thompson is my colleague who's helping co-host tonight, and Molly is going to be kind of taking care of the back of the house or the backstage. So if there's anything happening tonight that you're confused about, or the sound is off or something like that, she might be able to assist you from where she's at. I also want to let you know, we understand that we're living in a time that's unpredictable, and the internet and Zoom webinars can be the same way. So just so you know, if anything's happening with your computer and you're having problems tonight, we are going to tape this and we're going to be recording it, and we'll put it up on our website on a YouTube link in a few days. The other thing is, if something crazy would happen and the whole platform would go down, we would be in communication via social media and email, because we have all your emails, and let you know when we were going to run the program again. So just so you know, we have those safety things as backup. The other function that we invite you to use during this program is the Q&A function, where you can ask a topic-related question. So both Molly and I are going to facilitate a Q&A session for the second half of the event after Natalie speaks. We won't be asking questions during the presentation. We'll wait till after the presentation's over, and then we will bring attention to you the questions you've put in the Q&A and ask Natalie to answer them. So before we get going, I want to introduce my colleague, Molly Thompson, who is our newest member to the Vesterheim staff. And I know she will introduce herself better than I just did, and she'll thank our sponsors for the evening. So thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Leah. Like Leah said, my name is Molly, and I'm the Annual Fund Gift Officer at Vesterheim. And first, I do want to say thank you to all of you for coming here tonight and joining us for this virtual program. We're really excited to have Natalie here with us tonight as well. Next, I do want to take just a minute to thank the following sponsors who have really given generous support to help Vesterheim implement these types of online programs. So we do want to thank the Iowa Arts Council, a division of the Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs, and the National Endowment for the Arts through the Federal CARES Act legislation, Silos and Smokestacks National Heritage Area, and the Huebner Education Fund. So thank you to all of those sponsors. We really do appreciate it. If you all enjoy the program this evening and you'd like to help Vesterheim continue to offer more programs like this, we hope you might consider becoming a member. And if you're already a Vesterheim member, thank you for that. And we hope that you consider making a donation, which you can do online at vesterheim.org. Especially now, these are really tough times and those things are really appreciated, so thanks. And then finally, like Leah said, I am the tech support person tonight. So let me know in the chat, which you can chat to me directly, Molly Thompson, if you're having technical issues, and I'll do everything I can to try to help you with that. But again, we are recording it, so if we can't sort it out, we will make sure you can see the program eventually. And with that, I will hand it back to you, Leah. Thanks.
Thanks, Molly. So just to give you a little bit of context, we created this program, this folk art conversation program, which we plan to do monthly. This is our first one. We just relaunched the folk art school digitally here in July, but we have some other events coming up. Our purpose for these programs is to keep the Vesterheim community connected during this time when we're not open, but we also want to introduce some new audience members to Vesterheim and some amazing personalities and perspectives from the folk art world. We want to highlight our folk artists and visiting speakers, inviting them to share their expertise and talents in the various topics that they study or they work in the safe ways we can right now. And it's also a super fun, accessible way to engage with people from all over the country. And it's a way to celebrate folk art and highlight these unique perspectives, creating a forum for exchange. So that's where you come into the Q&A session after Natalie speaks. So without further ado, I would love to announce our presenter for tonight. Natalie Veston is a writer, artist, and infectious disease researcher from St. Paul, Minnesota. Her essays and art have appeared in numerous literary journals and anthologies. With E.A. Faro, she is the co-creator of Science Love Letters, a multidisciplinary art and postcard writing project that explores how being a scientist is like always writing a love letter. She has been an artist in residence in the Cassini House and Tulane University Special Collections Pandemic Artist Lab, the Light Gray Art Lab Norway Residency, and Kimmel Harding Nelson Center for the Arts, and the Collegeville Institute. She works in research on antimicrobial resistance at the University of Minnesota, and she has been studying rose mulling primarily with Julie Anderson in St. Paul for nearly 4 years. I was blown away by Natalie's project scrolling through Facebook, and I saw her post in this rose mulling group, which I sometimes peek into. And I just thought she had a really fascinating project, and one thing led to another, and I'm just so pleased to have her with us here tonight. So Natalie, I'm gonna turn it over to you to say hello.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much to Leah, Erin, Molly, and Margaret at Vesterheim for inviting me to be here and calling me part of the folk art world, which is extremely meaningful to me because it's just a deep love of mine. And I also just want to say thank you to everyone on the webinar for spending the last evening in July here on your computers with all of us. I really wish that we were all together on a porch somewhere talking about art as the crickets and the moon come out, but I think this will be the next best thing.
Awesome, that's so great. Well, Natalie, I have a presentation I'm gonna share. Are you ready to start the presentation?
I'm ready, yes.
Okay, great.
Let's see. Okay. So I am going to talk a little bit about a folk art project I started in March of this year. I began painting Swedish Dala horses. And a Dala horse, if you're not familiar, it's the national symbol of Sweden. It's usually a red horse, but they can be any color. And they are something that's painted with decorative arts and with folk arts. And I began painting these Swedish Dala horses repetitively to try and understand and interpret some images and data related to the pandemic. Next slide, please. So just to give you a little bit of background about me and where I'm kind of coming from when I start any art project. I am from St. Paul. I am an interdisciplinary artist, but I'm primarily a writer. And I really like to use drawing and painting to express what I'm unable to express in writing. And I also use it as a way to learn about something or as a way to research something that's troubling me or something that I'd like to understand better. I've been rose mulling for about 4 years, as Leah said. I'm really lucky to live in St. Paul where there's a small independent art store here that started offering rose mauling classes about 4 years ago. And I'm probably preaching to the choir a little bit here, but rose mauling is a Norwegian decorative folk art that is very technique based, and there are a number of different styles that are related to the different areas of Norway that people were looking at and trying to interpret. So I've been taking classes for about 4 years and really starting to build a community there that is incredibly dear to me and that I'm missing so much right now. Rose mauling initially I got into because it was so connected to my heritage. It was something that I saw growing up, and it was something that became more and more precious to me as the people who carried those traditions started to pass away. But one of the problems I've always had with rose mauling is that when I am thinking about an art project, I usually start with an idea first rather than an idea for an artwork. So some grand idea, and then I think, how can I express this in this particular art form? And with rose mauling, I didn't really have the skills to do that for a very long time. And so I had this idea of trying to use rose mauling and trying to use folk art as a way to communicate an idea. And I was very conscious of the fact that as I was learning and taking these classes, I was really starting to build a vocabulary with all of the brush stroke and the pigment work, and trying to understand the history and the different styles of rose mauling. And so I was very aware during this pandemic that I had this lexicon sort of in my back pocket that I could maybe use to try to understand something that I was having trouble understanding. And then the other part of my life is that I am an infectious diseases researcher. I work at a center at the University of Minnesota, and I don't work in a lab. My job involves looking at a lot of information and being able to aggregate that information and analyze it in a way that's helpful for other people. So for about 8 years at that center, I worked on a project that collected pandemic preparedness practices from states and localities, with the idea that these pandemic practices could be shared across the country and be applicable if a pandemic ever happened. And so it's really bizarre to me these days to hear people speak about things like quarantine and social distancing that I think of as being very related to this particular set of government and scientific languages. And now these have been sort of adapted to fit people's daily lifestyles. And for the past 4 years, I have been working on antibiotic resistance, and since COVID, have really pivoted to looking at bacterial infections and antibiotic use and resistance as it relates to medical care during this pandemic. So that's just a big swath of background. But in general, I just look at a ton of info all the time, and I try to understand it, and I try to interpret it according to what I think is the right thing to do, and a good way to be a human, essentially. Next slide, please. So a little bit about this project inspiration and timeline. What this project is a series of Dala horses. And I used the brush stroke work and the decisions about how to design them to communicate some type of data or a particular set of images that I was thinking about and I couldn't stop thinking about. So as part of my job, I was seeing a lot of data coming out of Wuhan, China in January and February. And I know that seems right now like ancient history or like something that happened a very long time ago. But at that point, not a lot was known about the virus other than that it was causing very severe illness. It didn't have a name at that point. There wasn't a good idea of how or if it would spread, and we didn't really know how our lives would change very quickly. But despite all of this uncertainty and all of these things that we didn't know, the data and the images from hospitals and from communities just kept building. And as a researcher, I deal with data a lot, but as a human being, I also think a lot about what it means to bathe in data and to carry this data around in my body and to represent other human beings as data. And a lot of that comes out of the fact that 2 years ago, my mom was hospitalized on life support for over a month with a type of catastrophic lung failure that is happening in patients right now with severe COVID. And she's doing super well right now, but it was something that really split my life and my ideas about data and research and art in two, and made me really question whether or not I was being useful and how I was representing human beings, precious human beings that I cared about. And everything I did since then was really dedicated to making sure that that never happens to anyone. And in the first half of this year, all of those questions and those concerns started to live their own lives in really big ways as we all adapted to this collective experience, while also having this fear front and center that people would be treated as expendable or as if they mattered less than other people, or as data points who are not seen as the precious people that we know them to be. And this is something that is just a constant troubling thing for me. I love data so much. I believe that it can be so helpful and so useful, but I also struggle a lot with the possibility that it dehumanizes. And I wanted to struggle with that in a small way in this particular project. Next slide, please. So from Dala to Data Horse. So as you might be able to guess, the inspiration for this project actually came from an autocorrect error while I was texting with my sister for some reason about Dala horses. So thanks, autocorrect. And when that happened, I was like, you know what, I'm gonna do a project where I use Dala horses. And a Dala horse is that little friends that you see pictured on that slide. And this folk art technique, all of this, these vocabularies that I've been building with the brush strokes and the pigments and the trying to understand rosemalling and dalmoning and courbets. And I'm gonna see if I can offload some of this data that I'd been carrying. And before then, I'd really just been spending the day at work, and then I would go outside and sit on the deck and just kind of feel this heaviness collect. And when my phone very nicely corrected Dala Horse to Data Horse, I was like, you know what? This is a horse that is so connected to my ideas of safety. These were horses that were in my house. They were seen as harbingers of good luck and happiness for a house. And so I thought, you know what, when so much is changing and I have all of these questions and all of these sadnesses, I can use this element of who I am and where I came from to return to. I can start to make sense of what's happening now with this particular horse that represents so much safety and home and family to me. And one of the things I didn't mention before is that I paint to learn and to pray. So I strongly believe that when I'm observing something very carefully, whether that's data, whether it's a brush stroke, I'm giving it some type of attention. And that type of attention, artistically or scientifically, is a way of pointing at something that's troubling me, or something that I'm scared won't matter to someone else, and saying, this is where it hurts, or this is worth protecting right here. And so I'd like to go through 10 of the horses that I painted. Before I do that, I do have 2 points. So the first point is that Dala horses or data horses are really sort of inherently terrible at giving medical advice. So there will be no medical advice offered during this presentation, thankfully. And the other thing is I have no qualms about mixing Swedish and Norwegian design. So if that might be something that upsets you, just be forewarned that you're going to see a fair amount of that in this particular presentation. So next slide, please. Oh, the one before that. Perfect. So this is my baseline horse. And this is my horse that I painted to prove to myself that I could paint a Dala horse and that I knew what a Dala horse looked like. And I wanted to get these strokes pretty close to the traditional idea of a Dala horse so that I knew what I was really working with and so that I knew what I could really adapt to thinking about how to represent data on a horse's body. And I've included some text on these slides that I'm not going to read to you, but these are things that I was thinking about as I was making these horses. And so this baseline horse is really about carrying data, feeling very heavy about carrying data and wanting these horses to start to carry some of this data and wanting to learn by painting these horses. Yeah, so that is the data horse at baseline. So next slide, please. And this is the first horse I painted after the data horse at baseline. It's the first horse I painted that I didn't throw away. But it is called Distant Desire Lines. And I painted it in late March. And I, at the time, was walking just about everywhere that I needed to go. And we hadn't, as a community, gotten into the habit of veering away from each other or trying to stay at least 6 feet apart. And so it was a little bit bizarre to veer away from somebody that you meet on the sidewalk. It made me feel sad, and it made me feel rude. Of course, a lot of that has changed, but I started to notice as I was walking and veering away from other human beings that as I veered away and as others veered away from me, they would use, or I would use, the boulevards. And the boulevards were kind of just starting to grow up at that point in the attempt at spring. And I realized that as we were arcing away from each other, we would be creating these lines in the boulevards where things wouldn't grow or they wouldn't grow as quickly. And so we would have all of this evidence about how much we cared for each other that would start to appear as the boulevards grew up. And those lines are actually starting, or they have been there. And it's just something that I think is really beautiful, this physical evidence that we have that we're all sort of caring for each other, even though we mostly don't know each other. Next slide, please. So this horse is related to some consternation with starting to see the same image over and over. And at the start of the pandemic, when images were coming out of Wuhan and out of northern Italy, people were really, really trying to understand what was happening. And one of the images that I just kept seeing during the work week was the image of bee lines on a lung ultrasound. And bee lines on a lung ultrasound it sort of looks like the beam of a flashlight shining down, or it looks like a comet with several tails. And it was just such a strange image to me. And, people just kept publishing these images and kept posting these images, trying to figure out what was going on based on these ultrasounds. And it was one of those images that I just really couldn't shake. And so I wanted to interpret it in a folk art style. Bee lines refer, it's an artifact on an ultrasound that it's usually because there's fluid in the lungs. And so this is people trying to understand lung damage during the early days of the pandemic. Next slide, please. I think there's one before that. Yeah, the little bird. Okay, so this is, this horse is called A Little Bird Corrects the Error. And this is a horse I made to think through some of the issues with what's happening in the scientific literature right now. With so many, there's this urgency, I think, to publish potential therapies or potential prevention strategies, all of these different things that might work. And very frequently there are errors in them, or they need to be withdrawn or corrected. But the paper with the error in it will sort of go out into the world, or it'll go out into press releases. And then when it's corrected, that correction won't actually go out. And so there's this need to sort of balance urgency with accuracy, which is very difficult right now. And it touches on something that is breaking my heart a little bit, because I've been working in infectious diseases for about 12 years. And just seeing so much fear right now and so much uncertainty and just shock that something like this could happen makes me really, really feel like I haven't done my job, like I haven't communicated anything that means something to me, to people who are really wanting to do the right thing right now. And A Little Bird Corrects the Error refers to a practice in the St. John's Bible, which is a handwritten and hand-painted manuscript of the Christian Bible. And because it is handwritten on vellum, the calligrapher is bound to make some mistakes. And so when the calligrapher makes some mistakes, there's a footnote made that corrects the mistake, and then a line drawn up to a little painted bird that flies the correction up to where the mistake is. And sort of there are these little birds that flit through scripture, correcting errors. And so it's really easy to see errors, but it's a lot harder to see these small corrections that are happening behind the scenes. Next slide, please. So I think this was the image that really started the project, even though I didn't paint it for quite some time. This image was inspired by lung x-rays and CT scans that were coming out of Wuhan and Italy at the time. And these were images of people who had pneumonia. And it was such a difficult thing to see. Pneumonia is typically, it's not terribly unusual to see a pneumonia where the cause is unidentified. And so that wasn't necessarily what had people edgy, but it was the fact that every single one of these lung x-rays and CT scans looked pretty much exactly the same. And that's just real weird. It's repetition where you don't expect to see repetition, because everybody has a different body, everybody has a different response to a particular disease. And so when you start to see things that look very much the same, it's really concerning. It's almost like an erasure somehow of the individual. And this repetition kind of starts to speak the language of alarm. Yeah, and these, what was seen on the images were called ground glass opacities. And they were something that just happened over and over and over in the same image. And so this horse, the tulips and the design, they're meant to represent the image seen on a lung x-ray or a CT scan, with the breastbone represented in the middle, and then the two lungs at the horse's chest and flank, and then the ground glass opacity is sort of, there are some little flowers in the middle there. Next slide, please. So the outside wants in and the inside wants out is a line from my sister. And I did this horse during the first days of the stay-at-home order. I think at that point we had been social distancing for quite some time. And we were starting to see some of the effects of decreased human activity outside in the world. And also just probably dealing with being at home a lot of the time. And so I texted my sister because I was so upset because this ant walked across my floor and there were these surprise snowstorms, and my sister texted back and she was like, the outside wants in and the inside wants out. And this is just something that I've been thinking about so much, these changes to the outside world as we're all largely at home, and also just kind of waiting to see what will happen. But also the fact that we're all in kind of a contemplative space, just because we're dealing with so much uncertainty and discomfort, and we're noticing things that we may not have noticed before. So while I was thinking on data, I was also sitting outside and I was collecting data on the birds that I saw, the robins and the cardinals, the catbirds. I was watching finches grow to adolescence and then become grown-ups and separate. There was a nighthawk every evening at 9 p.m. There were more surprise snowstorms. And I started to realize that all of these things were data, and just starting to think about data as resulting from this contemplation and curiosity born out of being extremely uncomfortable. Next slide, please. So a gradient is something that exits alignment in order to return to it. Yeah, I was thinking about homesickness and not being able to be home and in my parents' fields and swamps for Easter. And I did this horse to represent those fields, and also this alignment of Mars, Saturn, and Jupiter above the moon that happened at that time. And it was probably something that I never would have noticed if I hadn't been trying to notice everything or in a place to notice everything. But I was really thinking about communicating so much of what I've learned about the alveoli in the lungs and what an incredible feat that breathing is. So when my mom was ill, I learned so much about what is required in breathing and what the alveoli, which are the air sacs in the lungs, actually do. And they work as a gradient. So they actually fall out of balance in many ways, or they exit balance in order to return to it. So they're constantly adjusting air pressure and blood volume every second in order to get oxygen into the blood. And it's just this really beautiful, but also scary, tenuous system. And that's kind of what I wanted to communicate with this horse. Next slide, please. So the Dala Horse, another autocorrect. So a friend, I heard from a friend who referred to these Swedish Dala horses as Dala horses, and I was really touched by that. And when I was drawing this horse, I was thinking of this particular design that the Dala has, and thinking about how often this design is, it shows up in nature. So this past winter, I had an eye appointment, and after the eye appointment, I sort of took it on myself to figure out what on earth is happening when they dilate your pupils and why that's such a terrible experience. And I found out that there are these two muscles in the eye, and one draws the pupil closed and the other one radiates outward to draw it open. And so when you get the dilator drops, they don't actually dilate your pupils, they prevent them from closing. And that was just a really fascinating, bizarre idea to me, that your pupils want to close and they don't want to get this information, but they're prohibited from doing so. But then I started walking by churches, especially, and seeing this design, this dahlia-like design. And walking by churches, especially during the early days of the pandemic, where all of the signs said something like "stay faithful" or "take care of each other." And one church near me has a number of signs that walk through the Compline prayer, which is a prayer for protection. And just really thinking about how perception meets data and how there's such great opportunity for humanization when our perception of the real world meets what we think we know about the world when we're carrying all this data. Next slide. So this horse, I kind of just wanted to make this horse because it is based on a pattern of, on a textile that I took from my great aunt's apartments after she passed away. And at the time that I made this horse, I was really missing my family. And I, when I'm rose malling or dell molding, I always think of my great aunts because she was the one who really carried culture and taught me about culture in our family. And I started to see all of these photos from my empty hometown and was feeling really homesick and was really missing it. And so I just wanted to replicate this textile, but I also started to make lists of everything else that I took from her. So it was a number of books about the 1918 fire, which is the where I'm from, it's the real tragedy of 1918. There's some information about the pandemic, but the fire is really what we learn about in school and what we really consider the tragedy and the sort of common heritage that everybody in that area sort of learns about and takes on. And I just wanted to think through how we all are having this collective experience, but then we're also having personal and community experiences mapped onto that. And so there are so many layers of meaning for what is happening right now. Next slide, please. So this is the last horse that I'm going to be talking about tonight. And this is the horse where I wanted to think about the masking issue or the face covering issue. So there's a lot of discussion on masking and what face coverings accomplish and, you know, whether people should wear them. It's just really fascinating to me. So I think did I write on the side? Oh yeah, I like the face coverings because they cover the lines on the side of my nose. But I also like it because I can occasionally not think about the needs of somebody else as much as I should. And so when I see somebody with a face covering on, it makes me think of how my body and my actions are affecting other people. And it makes me think of my mom and how my mom deserves to be protected in whatever way she can be protected. And it makes me think of alveoli and this beautiful system that is so precarious and so strong, and how we're all teaching each other right now by our presence and our absence to care for these little astonishingly beautiful things called alveoli that we all have, and learning how connected we are and how precious we are and what we're going to do with that particular education. Next slide, please. Oh, I should mention with the past slide, I represented the alveoli as blueberries because I was thinking of my mom, who is a champion blueberry picker. So that's why those are there. Next slide, please. So what does folk art have to do with a pandemic? It is a really good question. So when I was trying to communicate this particular idea or trying to use folk art as a language to understand a crisis, I always felt that tug between having a lot of respect for this tradition that has been passed down and that people have worked so much harder on than I have, while also balancing having enough respect for tradition to be able to innovate and to use this forum as others have done all throughout the history of rose mauling and dell molding to understand new environments. And so I really wanted to carry with me throughout this project this respect for tradition that acknowledges that tradition is always moving, and it's something that always has something important to say to questions and problems that arise in our lives. And the reason that I really love folk art, and I really love Norwegian and Swedish folk art, is that it's so quiet and it's so unassuming, and it sometimes doesn't get as much credit or hoopla as other art forms. And I'm really fascinated by how much power an art form gathers when it's a little bit ignored or when it's sort of a little bit in the background. And so while the art gaze is elsewhere, folk art can kind of move freely and start conversations. And in that way, it kind of works as a way of communication. And as an art form, it's able to represent its surroundings and also imagine new ones. And it's also able to be handed down as part of who people are and how they think about their homes and family. And this is why it lasts so long and why it continues to keep sending itself so brilliantly into the future. It gives people something to return to and a sense of homecoming, something that's so important as so much around us is becoming unfamiliar. And it also offers this really amazing vision for what's to come and the type of world that we can carry into the future just by being its quiet self. And I just really love that about folk arts. Next slide, please.
I think that's our last slide.
Okay, awesome.
So I'll stop sharing now, but that was thank you so much. That was so wonderful. And I know that people have questions. So Molly, do you want to kick us off with a question?
Yeah, we had one come in the chat. And so Diane would like to know, what kind of paper are you painting on? And is that tempera paint or gouache? Am I saying that correctly? I'm not an artist myself.
Yeah, so it's actually the worst type of paper that I could have chosen for this particular project. It's a type of very rough, highly textured hot press paper, or not, it's not hot press, it's cold press. That is really beautiful. So I think they're about 6" by 6" square. Yeah, and it's the most beautiful paper, and I really wanted to use this pad of paper, but it is not the right paper for this particular activity. So there's that. And I'm using acrylic paint.
Awesome. We had someone ask if some people who couldn't be with us can watch this later, and yes, we're actually going to have a YouTube link, and we'll put it on our website as well. So yes, that will happen. Natalie, maybe if anyone else wants to ask a question, please feel free to use the Q&A, and Molly, you'll keep your eye on that. Natalie, I wanted to ask you a question. So I know that you're a multifaceted artist. So you're a writer, you're a musician, we see your piano behind you. And, you've been talking during this session about, the impact of family members and their folk art on you. So can you talk a little bit more about some of the other kind of arts that you were surrounded by growing up, and how that has influenced you today?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I was surrounded by a lot of rose mauling and a lot of Swedish and Norwegian folk art primarily because of my great aunts and great uncle. And so when I visited them, I always felt that that was the time to learn about culture or learn about heritage, or sort of be treated to these surroundings that were covered in this particular style of decorative art. And then growing up, my mom was an artist and my dad is a scientist. And it's really funny because they're both artistic in their own way. And so watching my mom make a life with art and watching her turn to art as a way to answer questions or address problems in her life. So to use art as some type of solution, or at least a conversation, was really fascinating to me. And then to just sort of go on drives with my dad and hear him tell stories about the landscape and his days as a taconite miner, and all of the just bizarre scientific facts that he knew and thought that other people should know, really gave me a love for my home. And it also gave me a way to look at the world as if it always has a surprise in store for you.
That's beautiful. Molly, I see some people are putting things into the chat. Do you have a question?
Yep, I'm going to grab one of those. So Kate has a message and then a question at the end. She says, "Thank you, Natalie. Your work traverses the historical moment of a pandemic with deeply personal landscapes and relationships. The walk to work, your mother. For me, that reach feels spacious at a time when life in many ways has shrunk. Is space a reduction of your work?"
I don't think a space is a reduction of anything. I think the idea of space is really a really beautiful way to think about any.
Kate meant to say, is space a product of your work?
Oh, a product. Is it a product of my work? I think it is, because I think as I've been working on these horses, I feel like we've all been having experiences that overlap in many ways. So it's almost like right now we're all living in many different worlds and trying to figure out which world we're in at any given moment. And so I think with these horses, they've been able to create space for kind of understanding I have to think about that more. For understanding, I think more of what the world could look like. I think one of the things I've been thinking about since the Pandemic Artist Lab, which was really brilliant, is this idea that Rick Cassini-Couture, who led the Pandemic Artist Lab, said, is that anytime you have a problem, you can take its hand and walk it back through history. And I was really fascinated by that, because I think we have this idea that history is something we can't do anything about. And it's right there with all of these problems and linkages that have happened. And so going back in order to create some space in the present for what we want to carry into a future that hopefully we're starting to strip of harm, because we're starting to see how these things are unfolding right now and how they're related to historical events. I think that creates this huge spacious moment in the present where we're in contact with both the past and the future, and we're making a lot of decisions about what this moment means, what we want to keep, what is no longer working, what we can really carry into the future. I think that's something I've been thinking about a lot lately, is how do we carry the terrible things and the wonderful things in this moment into the future to make sure that the harm that we've caused no longer exists there. Like, what are we learning right now?
Thank you. I'm going to read Natalie's question. What kind of rhythm did you have to this work? Did you do a horse per week, or did it depend on what was happening with the virus and how you were responding personally?
Yeah, so I purposely decided not to commit myself to any particular rhythm. Um, I really wanted to do a horse when I felt that in some way I was carrying something that was getting too heavy for me emotionally, or when I had a particular image, either something that I'd been seeing in a repetition or something that had bothered me that I needed a way to communicate. And I think so much of what I do just comes out of being generally unsettled about things and wanting not to be. And so trying to find a way to interpret those particular events or images in a way in which I can better understand what was going on. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. So no, I tried to make it not, I didn't want to commit myself to anything. I just wanted to do a horse whenever I wanted to do a horse.
Rebecca wants to know, what's next for you? Do you intend to continue painting Dala horses or go a different direction or medium?
Yeah, so I feel pretty strongly that all of my projects have a stopping point, and so I try to work as hard as I can generally to get as much done on them before they kind of stop themselves. And I feel like I really never want to work on that project again. I feel pretty strongly about only working on the data horses when I have an idea for them. I really want them to be meaningful and to be representative of what I'm feeling and to be representative of actual data, however loosely I've sort of defined that here. That being said, they live in a little book that has so many more pages, and I've based out all of the horses on those pages, and so I don't think I would be able to not finish that book. So I think I will be finishing that book. Yeah.
Oh, you're muted, Leah.
Thank you. Patty Goke is asking, you said you paint to learn and to pray. In order to move from the head, learn, to the heart, pray, how do you create the contemplative space to be open to the greater experience?
Honestly, I think just having folk arts as something that I can return to is that contemplative space. I feel I am horrible at mixing colors. I'm really bad at it, and it's something I struggle with. And I don't see color particularly well. So, and its color is so important in rose modeling. And so mixing pigments and trying to get that right color is something that, when it's not incredibly frustrating, does create that contemplative space. It's also that space where I feel very close to my family members. So there's just this particular shade of green where if I can get it right, and I almost never get it right, I feel incredibly connected to my great aunts. And so having these, being able to mix these pigments and see a pigment appear that reminds me of a color in northern Minnesota, that's something that hits me, especially right now, right in the heart. And so the pigments are a big part of that. And I've also found that while rose mulling, I'm really unable to feel anxious or angry unless I'm angry at the rose mulling, and then that's a different situation. But I think for me, just being able to work on these techniques to build these pigments and to do something that connects me to my family in such a strong way really creates a contemplative space.
Great. We probably have time for one more question, and so I'm gonna read Kathleen Kimball Baker's question. Natalie, who will you pass your painting skills on to as part of your beautiful tradition? And also she has a two-part. What are you able to express through your folk art that is less likely to be expressed through your amazing writing?
Oh, those are good questions. So as far as passing things on, I feel very strongly about people being welcome in folk art. And especially right now, I think we're seeing a lot of language and practices in which elders are sort of being posited as expendable, or elders are at risk, and there's just this really terrible situation where we're losing so many of the older people in our communities. My dream for like every day is to rosemall with whatever elder will have me rosemall with them. And part of that is just because so much of this tradition has been handed down orally, and there's not really like one big resource in which you can get all of the rosemalling information. And I would just really love to learn. And so that's my idea of passing something on, is just learning more. And then I forgot the last question. Oh, what do I get from it that I can't get anywhere else? I would say that connection to family, and also the fact that I can take really serious information, like information about infectious diseases, and use them in a form like the Dala Horse that is so linked to tradition and to identity, but is also a little bit silly. It's this squat, brightly colored horse. It's joyful, it's goofy. It's a great opportunity, at least for me, to take something really heavy and put it in this form that's both goofy and that I love and is connected to so many things.
Great. Well, I want to thank Natalie so much for sharing. She shared with me before we started that she has not been to Decorah or Vesterheim before. And I wish that you all had the ability to give her a round of applause publicly and entice her to come, because I'm guessing that everyone on this video who's familiar with Vesterheim wants you to come and take classes and teach you everything that they know about rosemalling. So there's a great place down here waiting for you, and we would be just so graced with your presence. So in safer times, we hope we see you at Vesterheim.
Yes, I would love that to no end.
And a lot of heartfelt messages are coming in through the chat, thanking you for your talents and sharing this, and also a lot of interest in seeing a book someday of all of these paintings and their meanings. People are really loving that. So
there you go. There's your next project, right?
That's really lovely. And thank you to everybody for just joining me. I hope you are able to enjoy this last half hour of daylight that we have. Yeah, thank you so much for spending time and learning about my horses.
Great. And I just want to, on behalf of Vesterheim and my colleagues, I just want to thank you again for tuning in. I want to let you know that, like we said, we will do these folk art conversations monthly as our plan. And the next one is August 27th at 7:30. And it's with Karen Keenan, who is doing traditional Swedish hair jewelry. And she's studied it in Sweden. And we're having a conversation with her about it. Karen and I spoke, and we felt like with the pandemic, there's a lot of talk about hair growth or lack of haircuts or the like. And so you may be inspired, if you watch Karen's talk, to pick up a new folk art form. Anyway, I hope I see you then. Check out our website, vesterheim.org. We are putting up new folk art online experiences all the time. And again, just thank you to Molly for co-hosting. Thank you so much, Natalie, for being here. And thank you to Aaron Burmeister, who is my team member and had his last day today because he did a lot of legwork on the front end of this. So thanks, everyone. Have a great night. We're so happy you could be here in the way that you can.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.